For Japan today to suggest, to imply that the Taiwan question is not 100% a Chinese national question is incredibly provocative. The the remarks made by the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi recently concerning the Taiwan question, I think, reflect some genuinely held views from her, because over her long political career, the Prime Minister has expressed very clear views concerning Japan's history and the belief that Japanese atrocities really were nowhere near as significant as mainstream historians now recognise as a consensus view. So she has been part of a revisionist section, if you will, of the Japanese body politic. Well, I think it's an exaggeration to start with. Clearly, the matters of another country's internal affairs do not pose an existential threat to someone else, particularly in this case, Japan. So I think it's first and foremost an exaggeration and certainly a mischaracterization of the issues at hand. The second thing I will say is that the remarks were also somewhat irresponsible, and some would say reflect the naivety, the foreign policy naivety of the Prime Minister. I'm not so certain of that, because I think it is quite clear that the Prime Minister has a long history of revisionist views concerning Japanese history, and certainly seeks to promote the remilitarization of Japan and Japanese society. That's certainly her political tendencies historically, and I think what we saw was actually a reflection of her genuine views of the world. If there was naivety, it's simply that she didn't understand that sometimes you have to maintain some control over what you say, particularly on these sorts of matters and in significant public domains. So an exaggeration, perhaps some lack of experience, but nonetheless, I think a reflection of some genuine sentiments that she holds in relation to Japan's historical role, where she is a proponent of a revisionist view of Japanese history and its atrocities during the war. And secondly, as a result of all of that, she is also somebody who tends to favour a Japanese remilitarization. The Prime Minister also, I think, perhaps lacks a little bit of judgment, which comes from insufficient experience in holding the position. Even if you have many beliefs and views in international affairs in particular, it is customary and responsible to exercise a greater degree of self-control over the expression of those views, because the remarks that you make obviously have significant ramifications for relationships between countries. So you have to be far more judicious and careful in your choice of words and the language that you use. So I think that they're the two main circumstances, I guess, insofar as the Prime Minister's remarks about the Taiwan question is concerned. There is a part of the Japanese body politic that has, ever since actually the Second World War, maintained a belief that Japan needs to remilitarize. And Prime Minister Takaichi is part and parcel of that particular part of the Japanese political culture. The remilitarization of Japan would, of course, involve a radical reinterpretation of its post-war pacifist constitution, and the recent comments from the Prime Minister about the nuclear question and the abandonment of the three aspects of Japan not pursuing the nuclear issue raises, I think, a lot of concerns, both domestically for people in Japan, given the history that Japan has, the unique history actually that Japan has in relation to nuclear bombs. But also, I think it raises a lot of questions for people across the entire region. So the remilitarization ambitions articulated by Prime Minister Takaichi would suggest that Japan today, under her premiership, is looking to once again flex its muscle And if you're somebody in Southeast Asia, North Asia, China, I think you have some reason to be concerned because of the historical experiences. Let me just say one more thing. This year marked the 80th anniversary of the defeat of global fascism and the defeat of Japanese fascism in Asia. And it is very unfortunate that Prime Minister Takaichi chose this year in particular to reignite concerns in the region about Japanese militarization and the risks that that poses to regional stability. Clearly, the relationship between Japan and China has over the years had its ups and downs. But as two important countries within the Asia region, in fact, the two largest economies within the Asia region, it's imperative that the political leadership from these countries find ways of ensuring that the relationship is stable for bilateral reasons to begin with, but ultimately also to make it clear to countries of the region that the two major economies are committed to regional stability, which underpins the opportunities for economic collaboration, economic development, and prosperity. So, instability, I guess, has been reignited as a result of these recent comments by the Japanese Prime Minister. The prospects in the short term, of course, are a little bit rocky because the issue involved is particularly sensitive. It's the 80th anniversary of the defeat of fascism, as we recall, and it's also a period where we reflect upon the fact that after the Japanese defeat in the Second World War, Japan was required to return territories across Asia that it had taken and colonised in previous decades. And the island of Taiwan was, of course, part and parcel of that settlement. So for Japan today to suggest, to imply that the Taiwan question is not 100% a Chinese national question is incredibly provocative. And as I said, I think it is an irresponsible intervention. It certainly does not contribute to bilateral relationships that are healthy and constructive. There are many issues in the region where collaboration between these two major economies is vital to long-term stability and prosperity, whether that is to support open trade, investment flows, the actual movement of people, whether it's for tourism, education, research, development, and of course, ultimately, collaborations in the area of financial stabilisation in a period when there are significant forces disrupting financial stability, or at the very least creating increased risks of financial instability in the region. I would like to think that the Japanese Prime Minister will take this moment to reflect upon the ramifications of what she has said recently on bilateral relations and also on regional dynamics, and perhaps focus her mind and the mind of the government on the issues that really do matter for the region at large. It is quite clear that the United States continues to pursue a strategy of containment of China. It is doing that through some new tactics or strategies compared to perhaps some of the more direct ways that the United States would have pursued this policy objective in the past. It's doing that by establishing a network of multilateral or minilateral relationships whereby the responsibility, the funding weight, and the risks in the event of conflict are pushed out to so-called partners and allies. Let's not forget that Japan, after the Second World War, has ever since been occupied militarily by the United States and occupied under the provisions of extraterritoriality. What that means is that American troops stationed in Japan, in the event that they commit crimes, cannot be prosecuted underneath Japanese law, but are dealt with under the framework of American law. This is a deeply humiliating circumstance and shows clearly that Japan, in many respects, lacks the capacity to act as a sovereign nation. In some respects, I think that the recent comments from Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi reflect some frustrations of this lack of sovereignty, but at the same time seeks to cultivate a sense of loyalty to America. And we saw the relationship that she tried to have with Donald Trump in the recent meetings that they had. So I think it's a complex set of dynamics, but ultimately the actions of Japan at the moment could be seen through the lens of acting as an American proxy. There are a number of small islands as part of the landforms in the East China Sea that have had a long history of actual independence. And one of those currently, of course, Okinawa, is where an American base is located, but which is administered by the Japanese. Now, there is an independence movement on the island. There has been a long-standing view amongst many island residents that they do not want the American base there. They see it as an invasion of their own sovereignty, and also one that brings all sorts of risks and unwanted elements to life on the island. I mentioned before that American bases actually are on Japanese soil under extraterritorial provisions. And we have seen over the years many instances of American servicemen on that island basically, conducting crimes, raping local women, and ultimately not being prosecuted under local laws. Now, for many people, when a foreign soldier conducts themselves in this kind of way, knowing full well that local laws cannot be brought to bear and you can't get local justice, then really it is very understandable that there is growing demands for the Americans to leave, and that there is a growing sense that the current arrangements are not only wrong today, but are actually a travesty of the historical independence of these particular areas and people.